Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the panel of today. I'd like to introduce the organizer of the event, Dr. Mir Khan, the director of the University of Kurdistan Hawler's Center for Regional and International Studies. He has focused on promoting and strengthening the connection of the university with the international research community since 2016. His center works towards identifying and supporting research topics that are of relevance to the Kurdistan Regional Government's national development. To date, the CRIS Center has organized 3 international academic conferences, with an additional one in development for September 2017. The conferences have led to partnership opportunities with institutions, organizations, and investors with the university, which parallels to Dr. Mir Khan's objectives and goals for the University of Kurdistan Region. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. I think it's normal to lose the momentum after lunch, right? I would like to welcome all of you. It's the first time that we have this kind of panel in University of Kurdistan. The title of it, we try to say that the title is The Regional Powers, Politics, and the Kurdistan, but we changed in the last minute because we try to have an outside-in approach to the Kurdistan region's stability. We try to avoid or dodge any Kurdishness mindset towards the stability of the region, because when you look at the history of, I was talking about the history after the 1991, the Kurds and the Kurdistanis in these regions, transformed from a liability to an asset. When I say liability, I mean when I'm talking about the literature, the way the literature talks about the Kurdish movements, and a part of a problem, so-called the problem of problems, to the part of solutions. We have four distinguished academics here. I'm going to read very quickly your bios. We have Jean Bajalan, Assistant Professor and Graduate Director, History Department from Missouri State University. Jean is an Assistant Professor of History at Missouri. He has previous thought in Turkey, United Kingdom, and Suleimania, right? He holds PhD in Oriental Studies from University of Oxford, and his research focuses on the origins of the Kurdish nationalism. We have Professor Vera. It's your first time, right? It's good to have you, Professor Vera Ikarios-Kelly. She's a professor of comparative politics, Department of Political Science and International Relations, scholars in residence, Siena College. Her research focuses on the Kurdish diaspora and mobilization, cultural expressions of ethno-nationalism, critical ethnography, and transnational indigenous movement in Latin America. She's an author of Militant Kurds, Dual Strategy for Freedom. She has contributed numerous chapters to edited collection of both Kurdish, Latin American social movement. She produced articles, appears in a lot of journals, Kurdish studies, peace preview, terrorism, political violence, Muslim minority affairs. It's good to have you here, Dr. Vera. Next we have, I think for the first time as well, right, Dr. No? Yes, in the University of Kurdistan. Professor Ahmed Oysal, Director of Orsam Center for Middle Eastern Studies in Ankara. He's a professor in political sociology in Istanbul University. Dr. Oysal graduated from Middle Technical University Sociology Department. He received his master's and doctoral degrees in the South Illinois University, USA. Previously, he taught in Pinar and Marmara University. Currently, he is teaching in Istanbul University's International Relations Department. And lastly, we have Dr. Denis Migord, PhD in politics. Tegras, I guess I hope to translate, pronounce it well, right? Can you help me with? Yeah. Pyatigorsk, right? State University in Russia. A PhD in politics, professor and author of more than 60 scientific papers. It's an amazing achievement in Eurasia, Dennis. Research interests, international relations, Middle East political process, problems, and national security arms control. Repeatedly held scientific educational internship in the countries of Middle East and Europe, among them Germany, Egypt, and Israel. It's good to have you here, and what I'm going to do is to let you start talking for a maximum 15 minutes. because I guess they don't have the stamina to have to listen to us 25 minutes. So let's speak, Jean, for 15 minutes. You can use the podium if you want. Then afterwards, we're going to go for the Q&A sessions, right, immediately afterwards. We try so hard to end up at 4:15.
I shall set my clock. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to the conference organizers for making this possible. So today, I am going to focus on a historical topic. I'm a historian, and so my talk today will be perhaps a little bit out of the norm for compared to the other topics that we're speaking about today. And as a historian, my job is not to make a political judgment about events in the past, but merely to lay out some important points, some important interpretations of the past, and I leave it to the audience to make any normative judgments on what I say. So the topic I'm going to focus today on is the question that animates the minds of many Kurds today. Why, after the end of the First World War, why, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, did the Kurds fail to get a state? Or even, we can look at it broadly, why did the Kurds end up being, in a more general sense, locked out of the Middle Eastern system? A nation state is one possibility, of course, but there could have been other forms of recognition of Kurdish rights, including constitutionally recognized language rights or regional autonomy, and so on and so forth. And of course, this historical discussion usually revolves around the question of why the pathway to Kurdish self-rule outlined in the Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, did not come to be, and why 3 years later, in the Treaty of Lausanne, was there no mention of Kurdish rights. Well, there are several dimensions to this question, and the first dimension we might look at are divisions amongst the Kurdish community themselves. As sort of many people know today, because of recent events, divisions within the Kurdish movement can often have very destabilizing effects on the Kurdish movement more generally. And these are, of course, nothing new. If we go back to 1918, right at the end of the First World War, following the Ottoman surrender in October 1918, we see the emergence of the first major Kurdish political organization of the post-World War I era, the Society for the Advancement of Kurdistan, which was established in Istanbul in November 1918 under the leadership of Sayyid Abdulkadir Effendi, the son of Sheikh Ubaidullah, who had led a major Kurdish revolt in the 1880s. And this organization operated a very sophisticated lobbying effort towards the great powers. At the time, there were representatives of Britain, France, and Italy based in Istanbul, and the Society for the Advancement of Kurdistan was able to lobby those individuals to secure Kurdish rights. Through Mehmet Sharif Pasha, a former Ottoman diplomat, they were also able to lobby in Europe at the same time. So we see in 1918 and 1919 a very sophisticated lobbying effort taking place, lobbying the British, lobbying the French, and lobbying the Italians. However, behind this lobbying effort, we see major divisions within the Society for the Advancement of Kurdistan over the question of what the objectives of the Kurdish movement should be. The leadership under Sheikh Abdulkadir Effendi pushed for autonomy within the Ottoman Empire, whereas a minority faction led by Emin Ali Bedirkhan pushed for full independence. And of course, these divisions eventually came out into the open, and in late 1920, the Society for the Advancement of Kurdistan officially split. And of course, this created a lot of confusion amongst European diplomats at the time over who represents who. And the ultimate conclusion of many British diplomats at the time was that the Kurdish movement was immature and did not represent a broader Kurdish interest because they were divided. So we have these divisions based on the question of autonomy versus independence taking place. And we also have the issue that these groups based in Istanbul, while focusing on lobbying the European great powers, became disconnected from the mass of the Kurdish population. So we see the Kemalist movement that emerged in Anatolia in 1919 and 1920, able to split off the Kurdish population, particularly in the provinces of Eastern Anatolia, from the Kurdish movement based in Istanbul. So this lobbying effort that was taking place was not reflecting the facts on the ground. The Kemalist movement was successful in portraying the Kurdish movement in Istanbul as collaborating with the British, but more importantly, collaborating with the Armenians. Many Kurdish tribes had participated in the massacres of Armenians that took place during the First World War, and so many were worried that, especially after Sherif Pasha made an agreement with the Armenian delegation in Paris, many were worried that they would lose out and many Kurdish lands would be handed over to Armenians, and the Armenians would seek revenge upon the Kurdish population. So we see these divisions playing a very important role in understanding why the Kurds were unable to press for either autonomy or independence. Another factor is the issue of great power politics. And again, this is another issue that should be in the minds of people today. Prior to the First World War, the main power that sought to ally itself with the Kurdish movement was Russia, Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia had a long history of attempting to subvert Ottoman rule across Kurdistan, and Kurdish political leaders increasingly looked towards Russia as a potential ally. And one of the most important figures in this was Abdulrazak Bedrkhan. Abdulrazak Bedrkhan, after 1910 and all the way up to his death in 1918, successfully managed to ally himself with elements of the Russian administration. Now, initially, the Russians were pretty skeptical about allying with Kurds. Russian policy had generally focused on supporting Armenians. However, by building relations not only with Russian diplomatic officials, but also with Russian scholars and Russian Orientalists, Abdulrazak Bedrkhan was able to help build within the Russian administration a pro-Kurdish faction. And this pro-Kurdish faction basically supported him when, after the Russians occupied the city of Erzurum in 1916, he was appointed governor. So Abdulrazak Bedrkhan was very successful in allying himself with Russian bureaucrats and with Russian political interests, and building a lobby of Russian scholars and diplomats who advocated for supporting the Kurdish movement. However, once the Russian Revolution of 1917 took place, Abdulrazak Bedrkhan's policies fell to pieces, and eventually he was captured by Ottoman forces in 1918 and executed. So this leaves us to the final part of my talk about the British. So in contrast with the Russians, who had a deep interest in the Kurdish question, Britain had a relatively light interest in the Kurdish question. Compared to Russia, which was the center of Kurdish studies and Kurdology during this period, Britain only had a handful of administrators who were experts in Kurdish affairs. The majority of the policymakers who designed the post-war Middle East were Arabists, and these included individuals such as Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell, individuals who ended up advocating pro-Arab positions. There were, of course, some individuals who, within the British administration, who did support the Kurdish question, most notably Major Noel. There were also other Kurdish-speaking officials such as Major Sohn, although Major Sohn, after his experiences in Kurdistan, was pretty anti-Kurdish. Therefore, Britain's interest in the Kurdish question largely and very quickly became a function of its broader Arab policy. So, therefore, the lack, compared with the Russians, of a group within the British imperial administration advocating for the Kurdish cause put Kurdish nationalists and Kurdish activists in a very weak position following the end of the First World War. And this resulted in 1923 in Britain basically abandoned Well, just to conclude, this lack of lobbying from British officials within the British imperial administration put the Kurds at a major disadvantage. And by 1923, the British had both given up in imposing the conditions for Kurdish self-rule in the provinces of Eastern Anatolia, preferring to make an agreement with the Kemalist movement. And in southern Kurdistan, their policy basically became subject to their desire to create a unified Iraqi state in which the Sunni element would be better proportioned to the Shia element in the country. Thank you very much.
You were 5 minutes ahead of time. Fantastic. Well, please, it's up to you, actually.
So thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to visit the KRG. I want to thank the university and especially also Hemin for organizing and making me part of this panel. My work especially focuses on diaspora activism, Kurdish activism. I'm originally from Germany, so I have done a lot of work in the European Union, predominantly among Kurdish diaspora organizational structures there. But since I teach at a university and do research at a university in the United States, in New York State, I now have begun to look more seriously into organizational structures of Kurdish diaspora communities and Kurdish KRG lobbying in particular. So what I would like to talk to you about is, first of all, that when I think of lobbying, I don't mean only hiring law firms, but I think of public diplomacy, media outreach, diaspora organizations. I want to think of it in a broader way, because I think that is what is essential for to represent the interests of the KRG effectively in the United States. So what I want to talk about a little bit is the idea that Kurds have managed to temporarily take advantage of potential opportunities in terms of lobbying the US government. However, those opportunities are often beginning to disappear. And what I want to lay out is sort of a long-term plan, how to think about the KRG's potential for improving its chances to reach government officials and the general public. So what I want to do is make some suggestions, and if you would like to think about those, that is up to you. But I wanted to just describe what some of the opportunities are that exist and where improvements could be made. So most of the Kurdish activism so far is happening in New York City, Jersey City, Washington, D.C., even though there are many other parts of the country that offer opportunities. I do a lot of interviews with members of the diaspora in the United States, and I also follow US governmental sources and nonprofit sources on documentation for lobbying. So one of the sites that I wanted to mention to you is called opensecrets.org from the Center for Responsive Politics. And then the Department of Justice also has the Foreign Agents Registration Act, the FARA Act, because foreign lobbying these days, for those that follow US governmental developments, know that it is increasingly considered with a critical eye as part of the sort of impeachment proceedings and investigations into the Trump administration. So acts that didn't used to be enforced very closely are now carefully monitored. There are, in essence, a number of things to consider. The divided US government offers various ways for ethnic lobbies to shape foreign policy processes, including opportunities to lobby elected representatives and to influence the executive branch. We can do that through public media projects and shaping public opinion. But let me move on to the 5 factors that determine whether a foreign lobby is successful or not. If you survey the existent literature, and let me say very little is written about the Kurdistan lobby as a new lobby, which is really too bad, but I think I will begin to do so because most of the examples that people look at relates to perhaps Armenian lobby, AIPAC, the American-Israeli lobby. We have the African diaspora, which is beginning to emerge. And for foreign governments, there's particular attention paid to the Saudi lobby, but also the Iraqi lobby. So there are 5 factors in general that we consider as essentially important to determine whether a lobby is successful in the US political system. The first factor relates to the strength of the lobby's organization, and that is measured by its size, its unity, and its management style. In comparison to many other Kurdish diasporas, the lobby outreach and the size of the Kurdish community is very small in the United States and extremely distributed. It is also quite diverse. So what in essence has to be thought about is how to capitalize on the diversity of the diaspora, on the geographic disparity, and how to reach representatives in various places. Unity is not in existence at this point because of disputes over directions, and management style, I think, is well organized out of Washington, D.C. So the second factor relates to the availability of financial resources. We know financial resources have come to Washington, D.C., however, sometimes more, sometimes less. And clearly we all understand why that is. Shifts, sort of fluctuations in oil prices, the question related to reconstruction, fighting ISIS, IDPs, refugees, and so on. We know all the reasons why there's fluctuation. What I want to talk about, however, is how to use the money that is available most effectively so you get more for what you lobby for. There we go. So the third factor besides financial resources that is very important and that I recommend the KRG think about is the clarity and resonance with which the lobby carries out its agenda. The message has changed. DC used to be exceptionally responsive to the message of the threat of IS. Tone deaf on that issue right now. The world has changed in DC and in the United States, and that is no longer a message that is carefully listened to. The fourth factor is it is so much easier to shape foreign policy interests in the United States if you find overlap. As long as the United States perceives a shared interest with the KRG, they're much more likely to pursue similar ideas. When you don't have a convergence of those ideas and the United States pulls in a different direction, it is extremely difficult for any ethnic lobby to achieve its goals. And then finally, you know, the presence or absence of influential opposition groups. Let's just say the Iraqi lobby from Baghdad spends a lot more money than the KRG has available. So money alone cannot solve that problem. So we have to think in different and new ways about how to achieve representative ideas in the US Congress and in the White House. So let me just move along on that issue. So I'll just focus on the formal lobbying issues in the United States. So since basically 2006, the KRG has had a very effective lobbying operation in Washington, D.C. You all know that for a while, Kuba Talabani was a very strong representative, followed by now Bayan Abdur Rahman. And they're both doing a good job with, or you know, she's doing a fabulous job with what is available at the moment. And what I'd like to point out are some of the opportunities that we should think about in terms of going beyond just hiring lobby firms. So when you look up the information, we know there is now required documentation that the KRG has, the Kurdistan region has had a number of formal lobby firms. These are lobby firms that are quite expensive. They have, you know, we have firms that are hired to advance oil and gas. We have firms that advance questions related to security. And each of these firms are specialized and cost a lot of money. But as I mentioned earlier, the money is never going to, the available money is never going to be able to compete with the money spent by Iraq. Not to speak of other, you know, Arab lobbies that are incredibly powerful. So what to do? I mentioned earlier that I didn't think reliance on the same ideas as before would be effective. One of the issues that I would suggest is to think about going beyond invoking grievances against Arab genocidal campaigns against the Kurds, or even warnings of looming Iranian expansionism. While those arguments may work for some, I think there are many more ideas you can pursue. And let me mention some of those ideas that I think would be valuable. So my argument is, since you can't compete on the money level, and interestingly enough, some of the same lobbyists are hired by the Iraqi government in Baghdad and by you. It's, you know, while you have your specific lobbyists, I'm not sure they always pursue all of the agendas as effectively as they could. In addition to formal lobbying, in addition to all the activities the office does in DC, I would suggest developing a 10-year plan. You can't continue to just rely on goodwill within Congress and the US military establishment to counterbalance what is developing. So I'm suggesting to conceptualize potentially emerging opportunities. We don't know, unless you know more than I do, what the next election in the United States will bring. I think everyone is increasingly confused. Will we have, I mean, impeachment doesn't look successful in the Senate. However, it is possible or not possible that President Trump will be reelected. Many people that I spoke with from Kurdish backgrounds had initially great hope for President Trump because the assumption was that he would be more hawkish with the Republicans. I'm not sure this has worked out very well. I think the policy has been, you know, confusing, in sort of, you know, an inarticulated direction that seems to shift regularly depending on who you speak with. So here are my suggestions. Pursue high-level contacts with the White House, but also with congressional delegations, the State Department and the Pentagon. There's no substitute to trust building than one-on-one relationships and diplomacy. I would suggest that you bring delegations of congressional representatives to Erbil. Bring them in groups of potentially supportive Republicans, and bring them in groups as potentially supportive Democrats. Build relationships for the long term. Among the suggestions I have for you are to pick representatives from particular states where Kurdish diaspora influences are strong. There are many Kurdish American voters, they will vote. Those representatives are incredibly important. We can't just rely on Washington, D.C. contacts, we have to broaden. There are many Kurds from Iraq. 2 more minutes. Yeah. There are many Kurds in Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee. That representative must be on your side. Another suggestion I have is work on a broader shift in public opinion in terms of, you know, what does the KRI stand for? What are its values? How does it reach the general public? Generally, I find it very disappointing that many Americans by now have forgotten ISIS and the Kurds. You ask about the contribution of the Kurds and many people will say, who? This is incredibly important to work on, constantly, continuously. Finally, what I would suggest is not only long-term diaspora outreach, but send young students, send not 10, send not 100, but send 1,000 young Kurds to study in the United States, in areas where they get a master's degree, where they understand how the inner workings of the United States government operate, and send them to collaborate with journalists, with experts in the United States, with scholars, to be able to effectively pursue elements of cultural diplomacy and political work. Finally, I would sponsor many op-eds, many people to write for newspapers. There are ways to do a lot of lobbying and cultural diplomacy significantly more cheaply than hiring big lobby firms, and also to have a long-term impact that maybe is more successful in shaping public opinion. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to have Professor Ahmed Uysal, Director of ORSAM, Center for Middle Eastern Studies in Ankara. You have your 15 minutes, sir.
Assalamu alaikum. I wish I speak Kurdish, but I think I go with English. Of course, I feel at home. This is my third or fourth time in Kurdistan. And we know the deep history of Turks and Kurds live together, and this is a positive factor for cooperation between Turkey and the KRG. They share one important social dynamics. They share a moderate version of Islam. They are far away from the radicalism and extremism that's coming from somewhere else. And this is an advantage to deal with the East and West and to deal with each other also. It's a positive thing, especially the teachings of Sufism, Jalaluddin Rumi, Abdul Qadir Gailani, Imam Naqshbandi. There are many examples. During and after the First World War, the two people did not want to separate. Dr. Jean also explained the Kurdish did not think themselves outside separately from the Turks. But the Kemalists later on, with the Treaty of Lausanne, of course, the Kemalists signed it and they forgot about the Kurds, and then they pressured on the Kurdish people with the policy of Turkification and stuff, which also we suffered from that. And with democracy, Adnan Menderes and others normalized with the Kurdish identity, Kurdish people, and also with neighbors. And when you look at the two sides of the border between the Turkish-Iraqi or KRG border, you see very similar people. I mean, you find Kurds in both sides. You find Turks and Arabs and other ethnic, maybe minority, even Christian groups. It's not much different. And both sides did not think of living separately. That's why the nationalist movement, or maybe that's why even the British did not pay attention to or did not like to support the Kurds in the beginning. In 2000, Turkey also did not like the Kurds to be crushed, especially fight with each other, and unfortunately Iraq. I mean, sometimes when we look at the symptoms, we forget about the major cause of the disease. Yeah, Iraq has almost never-ending wars since history. It's not because Iraqi people want to fight with each other, but some big powers, some external interests, they force these people sometimes side with this side or the other side, ignite each other with never-ending wars, cause major damage to Iraq, and everybody is suffering from that. But Turkey was not part of that. These wars did not want to see these happen. Even in 1996, when the Barzani and Talabani camps were fighting, Turkey mediated between the two sides to try to make peace with them. And during the referendum, I was in both Baghdad, the latest independence referendum. I visited both Baghdad and Erbil. I heard many times also with analogy from the Iraqis, from the Arabs or from the Kurds, many times saying that Baghdad government worked with Iran and suffered and generally get negative consequence. But the Kurdistan government worked with Turkey and generally prospered and benefited from that. So in the 2000s, generally with the opening again, with democratization, I mean, of course, I understand the sympathy for the Kurdish brother and sister there, but I made one time an analogy. Of course, the Turkmens are, close to Turkey. They are blood brothers, but the Kurds are more like milk brothers or like ikhwat al-rida'. And Arabs or other Muslims are brothers in Islam. And they are very close. So there is the legal and emotional right on each other. So I know the sympathy there, but the problem is not mostly a Kurdish problem. It's a problem of democracy and development. When we lack democracy and when we lack development, then people begin to force each other or blame each other. But with democratization, especially in the 2000s, both the Kurds and the Turks benefit from this development. Even the neighbors, also with the KRG, also benefit from it with the Turkish businesses, especially invested in Iraqi Kurdistan, providing both employment and stability in the region. As a gateway to Turkish exports also to both Iraq and the Arab world, KRG also benefited from trade between Turkey and Iraq, and also between Turkey and the Arab world. But when the Maliki government stopped, for example, sending the KRG's share of the budget Turkey also did help them to sell their oil, which was a major thing, and also maybe causing now legal problems with the Baghdad government, causing problem with Turkey. So also, Turkey doesn't see Baghdad and Erbil as alternative to each other. They are partners, they are equal partners. I mean, in terms of, the brotherhood, of course, we see the unity of Iraq, but we don't see them as alternative. And Turkey also did not benefit from the sanctions on Iraq during the Saddam time. Today, there are sanctions on Iran. Turkey doesn't benefit from it. And even also causing problems because Iran is now more desperate to open up or to use Iraq territories or Iraqi business more and maybe trying to put pressure on Turkish exports, etc. But we do not feast on others' problems. Especially Turkey was against foreign interventions in the Iklim or in Iraq overall, which is mostly like American and Iran is intermingling with the Iraqi affairs very much. We also focus on the return of the refugees that escaped from the ISIS, especially there are many Tel Afarians, and we want them to go back safely. And we hear that, somebody, a distant cousin, this morning we talked about ISIS, and you cannot treat the whole people as if it's a big group. You cannot put all of them into prison. I mean, one of the, I think, professors talk about it. And there is like somebody joined, they are like, there is lawsuit against him or his family or blackmail. So it causes or makes them fearful when in Turkey or somewhere, they don't want to come back. And they are part of Iraqi society, be inside the KRG or outside the KRG, but it's an important topic for us. So especially how the relations after the referendum, I think it began to recover and began to normalize. I think that I see more hopeful future. But the new government, of course, we wish success for the new government, the KRG government. And their attitude also will determine the relations between the KRG and Turkey. Especially PKK is a big headache, big thorn in the toe, causing a big problem, and it's a big hinder. And sometimes, because they are Kurds, people misunderstand the PKK. Both PKK and the Gülenists that we had in Turkey, you should see them as the American proxy. I mean, no doubt about it, because they don't serve their own people, they serve to other agendas. When Öcalan and AK Party government was sitting on the table and they were about to agree on the terms, the American impositions and suggestions sabotaged the deal. And still the same in Syria or inside also the KRG, you'll see it's harmful to KRG. Now inside Turkey take a lot of significant measures. PKK cannot operate very much, but I think it's going to be a big problem for the region, but it is already a problem between the two sides. And there is also the Turkmen file. I mean, it is a bridge. It's a positive thing, I think. I don't see a big problem there, but the Turkmen situation, always as a bridge between the two sides, will help to improve. And I know the Turkmen officials inside the new government also very positive thing. And of course, we know both sides should pay attention to the stability, and especially also the Gülenists that try to harm Turkey's democracy and established or attempted a coup inside Turkey, caused a big big problem, economic, political, and a lot of sufferings. They can do the same here or anywhere else because they are working with a different hidden agenda. Don't be fooled by their own nice discourse, but they are a secret and very organized organization, and you know secret organizations can do what they can do. I mean, it's very obvious. So as a summary, I mean, the northern Syria, like Kandil, sovereignty, we talk about it, and it came too many times also during the referendum. If you cannot control a place, it means you are not sovereign there. If Iraqi territory, as an Iraqi territory or as a KRG territory, if you cannot control Kandil or Sinjar or Mahmud, leave it to an unrecognized authority, unrecognized military power, it means it's not your place. Why you try to take, of course it is legitimate and it should be, take lands from the control of ISIS, also the KRG government plus the Iraqi government should also take these lands controlled by the PKK, and it is becoming a maybe threat, or it has its own self-sustaining dynamics. And in brief, the success story overall in the KRG is a good thing for the region, for everybody, for the Arab world, for the Muslim world, and Turkey also is a more or less, I mean, is a success story. Without oil and without foreign help, Turkey managed a serious development. So equally and in cooperation between the two sides, I think they can do a better future and they can play a positive role in the stability and the development of the region. Thank you very much. Zor spas.
Dennis, you're the last one, right?
Well, to begin with, I would like to thank University of Kurdistan Center for Regional and International Studies, and of course, Kurdistan Regional Government for organizing this outstanding and remarkable conference. And I'm going to talk about Russian narrative, or broadly speaking, Russian vision or perception of Kurdistan regional government and its modern strategy. And first of all, I would like to say that it should be obvious that the KRG's emerging strategy for stability, and I should add for security in Iraqi region, is happening simultaneously with the emerging role of Russia in the region. That is why it is necessary to point out that Russia now can be regarded as one of the leading non-regional actors that have a significant influence on various processes in the Middle East. And the core idea of my presentation that Russia but sticks to the principles of regional security and regional stability. And that is why Russia support and try to cooperate with the actors, with different parties broadly speaking, which do the same. And while seeing success in achieving these goals from KRG, and while seeing a lot of successful initiatives from KRG, it is, to my mind, Russia will do everything to intensify cooperation in future with Iraqi Kurdistan. In this regard, it is also necessary to briefly outline the general agenda of Moscow's foreign policy in the Middle East. Now it can be easily said that Russia is currently acting as one of the security providers in the Middle East. So within this framework, it should be declared that the major goals of the Russian Federation in the region are peace, stability, territorial integrity, protection against terrorism, and upholding the norms of international law. Most Russian experts agree that after 2024, after the new cycle of the election in Russia, the Russian Middle Eastern policy will increase due to a number of accumulating factors. The first one is energy. The second one, increase of eastern and southern directions in the foreign policy of Russia. The third one, the possible emergence of new integrational schemes and regional actors in the Middle East. Next, the closure of well-known collective formats. Next, the desire of the countries of the region to diversify their foreign policy. And the last one, possible emergence of new threats. So we should add also that Russian strategy in the region is volatile, and it's important to maintain or ensure adaptability in the Russian strategy. So we can say that Russian strategy in the Middle East should be flexible, and we can call it strategic flexibility. That is why Russia is ready to interact with all regional actors that meet the goal of achieving regional, as I have said, regional stability and security. And among such actors, of course, Kurdistan Regional Government. Dr. Bajalan have already told a bit about history during Tsar period, during Russian Empire, about relations with Kurds, but I want to add some milestones, some extra milestones. So, Russia has traditionally maintained contacts with the Kurdish political forces in various parts of the region. The unresolved Kurdish issue periodically influenced the agenda in Moscow. Since the end of the 19th century, Russia began to interact more actively with the Kurds. So in 1923, on the territory of Soviet Azerbaijan, a Kurdish district was created and transformed into Kurdistan district with a center in the city of Lachin. However, in the 1930s, it was abolished. After the outbreak of the Second Cold War and the deployment of Soviet troops to the North Iran, the USSR developed an interest in Iranian Kurds. Moscow was pleased to hear the news about the establishment of Mehabad Republic in Iran in early 1946. However, unfortunately, it was destroyed by the Iranians without lasting even a year. Commander of the Republic's armed forces, the future legendary leader of Iraqi Kurds, Mullah Mustafa Barzani, with his followers, broke through the border into the USSR, where he received some kind of an asylum. After the 1958 revolution in Iraq, Barzani and his associates were given an opportunity to return to his country. The interaction of the USSR with the Kurds of Iraq was especially active during the Iraq crisis in 1960s, 1970s. The USSR acted as a mediator between the Kurds and Iraqi, led by Saddam Hussein. The period from 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to year of 2000 can be called a stage of the decline of Russian foreign policy in almost all areas, including the Middle East. Our country began to actively restore its position after our current president, Vladimir Putin, came to power in that period. Today, Iraqi Kurdistan, from the point of view of Russia, has all signs of wide autonomy. The region has its own flag, anthem, constitution, and so on and so forth. Also, most Russian experts share the idea that wide autonomy was the result, as it has been already said today, was the result of the contribution made by Kurdish formations in the fight against Daesh militants and successes in this field. With the increase in Russia's presence in the Middle East, interaction with Iraqi Kurdistan in various fields, including energy, has intensified. By but I should say it right now. It's my personal opinion that our cooperation is lopsided because it's mainly concentrated in the energy sector, and it is not enough, to my mind. For example, such Russian companies as Gazpromneft, Bashneft, and other work in the region. Over the past 2 years, the role of Rosneft, another our company, has grown sharply, and the transfer of Bashneft, already operating in Kurdistan, to Rosneft's control automatically provided the latter with a presence in the region. At the end of 2016, it became known about large contracts between Erbil and Rosneft. Additional agreements were also signed at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which made Rosneft, in fact, one of the leading energy companies in Iraqi Kurdistan. Rosneft gained access to the management of energy transport system with a capacity of 700,000 barrels per day. By the end of 2019, this level is planned to be increased to more than 1 million barrels. And the amount of Rosneft's possible investments in autonomy has not been disclosed, but it is believed that it is approaching about $4 billion. By the standards of Iraqi Kurdistan, this is a very significant investment, especially taking into account that the first contracts were implemented on a prepaid basis. Next, Moscow follows the opinion that any change in the status of individual regions and regions of various states is an internal affair of these countries. Thus, theoretically, any change in the status of Iraqi Kurdistan should be the result of negotiations and the mutual desire of all interested parties, primarily Erbil and Baghdad. After the collapse of the USSR, the Middle East was not considered, as I have already said, Russia's priority region, but Moscow needed to strengthen its presence in the region. That is why Russia is considering the possibility of emergence of new states on the map of the Middle East, which are ready to actively work for regional stability and regional peace, probably as a good prospect. But at the same time, Russia tries not to take any part now, because we don't want, when saying we, I mean Russia, right? Yes. We are trying, I wanted to say to sit on the fence, yes, but we are not sitting on the fence. We are just trying to be pragmatic, because we are not sure what will be the result of negotiations between Erbil and Baghdad within 10 years, for example. And that is why pragmatism in Russian foreign policy and contacts with Kurdish representatives at present time allow Russia to adapt to various scenarios, whatever status of Kurdish political entities will acquire. And in the very end, I would like to add one more idea that is now is being spread among Russian experts and among Russian scientific society, that the broader approach to the problem of Iraqi Kurdistan became possible after the case of Kosovo in 2008, when a free interpretation of international law regarding Kosovo made Russia's policy more flexible, because it can be proved, for example, by the situation in Georgia, and when Russia recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And that is why a lot of experts believe that Russia can be more active with the prospects of interaction with KRG in the future. Yes. And one more thing I would like to add, that I would like to highlight this in the end, that my personal approach that our policy towards Iraqi Kurdistan is very lopsided. Yes, as I have said, we have to act more rapidly, not to lose our role. Yes, thank you.
Okay, we're going to have almost 30 minutes for Q&A session. So if there is a question, I'll make sure that we have the, first thing first out, right? So go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Karoch. I'm a graduate of University of Kurdistan Howler. I have a question for Mr. Ahmed Uysal. First of all, thank you for saying Kurdistan rather than using a bunch of other weird phrases used by the Turkish media, such as Kurdish administration or Northern Iraq or anything else. Thank you. My question is, as long as you mentioned the Turkmens, why do you think the Turkmens of Iraq and the Kurdistan region are so much divided? For example, the Turkmens in Erbil, their political rhetoric, I mean, they are very sharply and widely divided. Like the Turkmens of Erbil are very different than the Turkmens of Kirkuk. And inside Kirkuk, the Turkmens there in the city center, they have a very different political view, and they support very different political parties than those of Ndaquk, just 20 kilometers southern of the city, than those in Dus Khurmatu, and than those like on the other planet of Tal Afar, the Turkmens of Tal Afar, who are like they are like from another country, and especially as some of their very well-known figures, tribal figures, were associated with ISIS, the Sunni parts of Turkmens in Tal Afar. They had very big leaders within ISIS. What's the reason for this? Thank you.
So let's take questions first, then. Yes, the very end.
Somebody behind me? Yeah, somebody behind me.
All right, well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for this wonderful panel and insightful comments. My question is for the panel, but specifically for Professor Akarius-Kale. Now, you mentioned a few wonderful recommendations about what the Kurdistan region can do about lobbying in the United States, and one of the things that you mentioned that we should be able, or the KRG should be able to go beyond lobbying in the Washington, D.C. I wonder if you could comment on the need and the value of perhaps teaching Kurdish to American school children or teaching Kurdish at American universities as a way of lobbying Kurdish interests in the long run. Thank you.
And we have Professor Cindy, then the panel is going to answer the three questions first, then we're going to go back to the other questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Excellent panel. My question is to the Madam Speaker on diaspora and the discourse of the Kurdish diaspora in the United States, specifically speaking. I fully agree, second, what you said in terms of the logistics, finance, and being a huge country, you can find that Kurdish diaspora has been dispersed around, and I've seen it, with my own eyes personally, and it's difficult for people to gather, especially in Washington, D.C., unless those who live in the, larger area of D.C. and Virginia can go there. Nevertheless, I would like to hear your take on the Kurdish discourse itself. You mentioned what is needed or how the United States policymakers would think of and what's intended. But how do you evaluate the Kurdish diaspora, if any, the quality of the discourse there? We, if I'm not mistaken, have generally showed the atrocities that have happened here and the victim side of it. do you think that we need to change the discourse to show the importance of, being players, key players in the region here? How would you depict that? How do you analyze if we have a kind of a content analysis for the discourse over there? How do you see it? Thank you very much.
Yes, let's go for Professor Ahmed. Do you want to respond to that? And I have questions for Jean later on.
Yes. In Arabic, they say, أهل مكة أدرى بشعابها. So you know the Turkmen situation, of course, better, and there are maybe Turkmen brothers and sisters among us. I feel it's kind of a psychology. I see the difference. The Kirkuk, they were like their majority, and they were oppressed by the Ba'ath regime, Ba'ath al-Arabi Qawmiya, whatever they call it, with very harshly, and they were expelled, or even there was killings. At that time, of course, the Kurds were also oppressed by the same regime. So there is, in there, you have a reaction toward the Arab nationalist regime. In here, you have more solidarity. I think even after Americans left, or the invasion and Saddam is toppled, the mood didn't change much, but there is so much debate in Kirkuk and other disputed territories, and the emotions are, going high, and sometimes it reaches to more radical side in both sides, not on the Turkmen side, maybe also in the Kurdish and sometimes the Arabs or Turkmen. It is the interaction, and I'm a sociologist, it is interaction that makes a difference. If you have a peaceful environment, you don't get to these highly loaded emotions. In other parts, you see the difference, but I see a difference. We should look into it more detail. Yes, this is my...
Professor Vera, you've got 2 questions, I guess, right? Yes, it works. It works.
So
it just takes 3 minutes, 3 seconds.
3 seconds?
Yeah.
3 seconds. Okay. Those questions are, in essence, also interrelated. So, Dr. Gurses, thank you very much for the question on language instruction. I think it would be essential to introduce both the option of Sudani and Kurmanji at universities in the United States. It would allow American students to study those languages and feel excitement about coming here to study or study abroad. I think it's a very excellent idea to sponsor that. American universities, unfortunately, have cut back on their language programs, so now we see sponsorship from international governments to restart language programs. So I would think this is a fabulous way of strengthening the relationship between the Kurdistan region and the United States, and to also bring up young Americans to think about this region for the future. Secondly, on the discourse of within the diaspora, the Kurdish diaspora in the United States is there are deep divisions because they arrived at different times and have had different experiences. What in essence is important is to overcome some of those divisions, work on reconciliation, have members, a larger team in the Washington, D.C. liaison office visit various communities all the time. Once a month, do a visit, do cultural events, speak on the vision for the region, reach out to a lot of business people. We have very powerful, emerging Kurdish business people in the United States who are deeply committed to the future of the region. So those are essential members of the community to reach out to. And then finally also, it is good to remember not every Kurdish American has the time or the money to go to Washington, D.C. They're hungry in Nashville, Tennessee for people to visit them. They're hungry in North Dakota and South Dakota, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, And in Binghamton, New York, is a new Kurdish community. There's so many pockets of Kurdish communities that feel forgotten by the homeland, and when they're called upon to help, they're not quite sure at what point or who will even be interested in them. So this is a great opportunity to improve relations.
My question to you, Jean, is, shall I wait for 3 seconds, or? What if you rule out the internal division and look at the historical perspective? What would be the other phenomenon, I would say, that halts any Kurdish national movement?
I mean, other than...
Try to have an inside-out approach to it.
So other than internal division. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at most of the political science research on which nationalist movements are successful and which nationalist movements are not successful, it comes down to external support, whether they're able to win external support and whether they're able to win legitimacy within the international community. And how, you know, it's just a hard truth. It doesn't matter how severe, you know, the strength of a political mobilization doesn't necessarily equal international acceptance of a cause. If we look, for example, we can go back to the late Ottoman Empire. You know, in the late Ottoman Empire, you had a very active Armenian movement and a pretty sort of underdeveloped Albanian movement. But because of the interests of the great powers, Albania became an independent state and Armenia didn't become an independent state. So the level of political mobilization, and if we're talking about whether or not a state becomes independent, is actually secondary to the interests of the great power. And I would like to add something onto the talking about lobbying. Beyond seeking full national independence, there are still a variety of ways to ensure that Kurdish interests are protected. You know, at the end of the day, whether Kurdistan is a sovereign nation state or not should be of secondary importance to whether or not the Kurdish community is safe, prosperous, and developing. And I think we need to, you know, to add on to Vera's point about the lobbying community, the KRG is never going to have the same amount of money that other states are going to have. So they have to approach their lobbying efforts in the same way as the Peshmerga approached military affairs in the 1970s, basically asymmetrical. So again, one has to rely more on the diaspora, the goodwill of the diaspora. That means working with, as you said, with local communities. And in the United States, voting matters. So making sure that, I mean, in Miami, you have basically the Cuban lobby holding up any peace with the Cuban government because they're a powerful voting bloc. So these kind of things matter, and basically the game that the KRG has been playing in DC, they've tried to be Turkey or Saudi Arabia or one of those countries that can pour money into lobbying from top down, whereas in reality, they have to play a different game because you're never going to win in a straight-up money fight. So this means you have to come up with different strategies, and that includes spending your money more judiciously, building up sympathy, allowing people to study Kurdish. There hasn't been too much buy-in, for example, in Kurdistan for teaching Kurdish overseas. Why? Because people are like, well, why would people want to do it? But the point is that when you have people who speak the Kurdish language, they're invariably, or most of the time, they're going to be inclined towards the Kurdish position. And this is something that people have to think about when deploying the lobbying resources.
I'm going to ask you a question that's going to go back to the audience. What would be the Russians' perspective and the Kurds next door, the Rojava situation? And the Russians' perspective of Syria, and especially the Rojava situation.
In Syria?
Yes.
As I mentioned in my presentation, the main idea of Russian foreign policy towards Syria is integrity. But as I can assume, taking into account different speeches and different works, scientific works on this issue, maybe Russia is getting ready for decentralization of Syria. Because it is obvious that Syria, as it used to be before the start of the Syrian crisis, territory, it will not exist. Yes, because there are so many included parts in this process. Yes, so Russian strategy will be maintenance of Syria, but probably in another format. For example, like we do nowadays in Ukraine. Yes, we do not disintegration. Yes, Crimea is another issue. It's totally different. But taking into account in Donbass, the same. We want integrity of the country because disintegration is always leads to destabilization. We want integrity, but in different format, in another format, in probably federal format, federalization.
We have a question here.
With wide autonomy, of course.
Okay, some sort of federalism, right? Then we have Francis, and yeah. Of course.
Good afternoon. Majdar Saleh, MA student at the University of Kurdistan. My question concerns the diaspora, Kurdish diaspora. One of the characteristics of Kurdish diaspora, especially in Europe, they are divided over two blocks. One represented by KRG and other represented mostly by PKK. So how to overcome such dilemma? Because, you know, one bloc blame other bloc that you are not representing the real Kurdish question. And other bloc blame is you sacrifice the interest of the Kurdish in general to the interest of, you know, an entity, KRG. So what would be your suggestion for the Kurdish politician and academies to find a common ground and to overcome such challenge?
This is to Dr. Vera, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You got right? Francis, do you want?
Francis Ouch from University of Exeter. Thank you to the panel for all your contributions. And I just want to make my point kind of raises some of the issues of the panel, this panel and this morning, and also Emin, his point about federalism. I mean, for example, Dr. Jenny talks about the early historical period, and we, in a sense, all states are artificial. They've all come about from an artificial process. And we now have a federal form of state. But federal states are works in progress. They don't just, I mean, for example, we talked about the importance of following the Constitution, but the Constitution came about through a process of trying to get people to sign up to the initial agreement. All federations, all federal states have taken forms of development over many years. So my question to the panel is how do you think this process can be supported by the various international partners involved, and are there any particular steps which can be undertaken? Dr. Vera mentioned about building trust, that being a key factor in all processes. Are there any particular little micro steps or processes which can be undertaken to help the thorny issues of federal states become resolved?
So I reckon this you address to all of them, right?
In a sense, yeah. Yeah, anyone who feels they could comment.
So anyone wants to reply. Then we're going to go for Dr. Kuba, then we're going to go for Mamasa Kurdnejad, of course. So we need a mic. It's the very end, Dr. Kuba.
Thank you very much for the fascinating panel, and we heard some great recommendations on how to lobby effectively in the United States. I think that you gave an excellent list of very sophisticated methods, and You pointed out that it needs to be an asymmetric type of engagement because of the limitations of the Kurdish regional government in terms of resources. I'd be interested to know if you think that this same strategy might apply elsewhere, and it would be particularly helpful to hear from the rest of the panel as to whether the recommendations that we've had laid out might work in Russia or in Turkey.
And the last question, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Kurt Nishad. I am from the Institute of Research and Development in Kurdistan. I have a comment which will, a little comment, very short comment, which will cover both the previous panel.
Would you just speak up a little bit?
Okay.
Please.
My comment will cover some of discussions in previous panel and now, and it is about the phenomena of terrorism, which is going to be a long-term challenge for this area, for all these analysis and questions that we are discussing now. Level of analysis is very different. Which level of analysis do you choose to deal with the question? Here we are dealing with the questions from very different and very various levels of analysis. One point we should, very important to remind the public is in 1944, 1945, we had 3 official states of fascism. And we had in many other countries, many people who were identifying themselves by that ideology, and they were saying that we are fascist. In 1947, you couldn't find 2 people who would say we are fascist. This is a very nice and very important parallel to the situation that we are meeting now. The world united and took on the fascism. After 2 years, there were nobody who would proudly stand up and say, I am a fascist. It is the same phenomena we are meeting now historically when it comes to the terrorism in this area. It is not just a question of KRG, Iraqi government, what we do in development levels. It is an international problem. It should be dealt by the world, a united world. This, when it comes to the ISIS people who join ISIS in our region, and then there was a question about why people join ISIS in developed countries, in Western countries. No countries in the world are international phenomena. All the countries in their own right are very much particular. They are built on particularities. They are built on their national existence. So there is no country is universal existing in their own right. They are very particular. And the failure in West, due to the identity politics, has put us in this position that even in the West, people can move, be marginalized, can move towards this kind of extreme movements. Identity politics is divisive.
Yeah.
Nationalism is a policy of managing a nation's politics and economy, nothing more and nothing less. And nationalism is another word for politics, for running a country's economy and a country's political life. And That's all. Thank you.
So no, you're not going to extract any questions on it, just any comment, right?
It was just a comment.
Appreciate that.
And thank you so much.
So what is going to happen, then I'm going to go and ask you, everybody, to first answer the questions. If it refers to do, then 1 minute of your final remarks, and we're going to end the panel and the conference day as well. So, yep.
Okay. Speaking about federalization, yes?
Yep.
Or one more time. Frankly speaking, I can't give you a certain mechanism how it should be done, but to my mind, first of all, it should be done internationally, because all sides, global powers which are involved in this conflict, they should solve their own problems, and there are a lot of mechanisms for it. For example, Geneva, yes, Astana conference, and so on. And then the problem should be solved regionally, because regional actors should solve their problems towards Syria, yes, and solve there, and then domestically. And probably that could be done gradually with the help of Russia or the United States. It doesn't matter, but the situation should be solved. And probably the key factor of future format, not probably, but it is, the key factor of the Syrian future are Kurds, because it's up to them to decide the future, whether they want to be independent or whether they want to be partially occupied from Turkey. It's up to them to decide. And that is my point of view of federalization. And there was a question about diasporas in Russia. Yes, there is a big diaspora of Kurds in Russia, but politically they are not engaged, as I know. Maybe they are engaged, but politically they are not engaged in the process of foreign policy making, as I know.
Okay. Yeah.
As I.
Yes, it's working.
Yes. I don't know if I missed a question. I generally heard general comments, and I had my last comment. Did you have a question for me?
Actually, no. I'm going to ask you to have a final comment. Maybe.
Overall, I think when KRG and Kurdistan experience with democracy and development, and Turkish democracy and development are two exceptions in the region, which is good. That we don't want to be exceptional, but we want everybody to be prosperous and more stable, which is the region. Yes, and sure. As a more industrial and producing country, export-oriented country, Turkey also needs a stable region. Doesn't benefit from arms sale or from other conflicts. So the same for the Kurdistan region, and we benefit from peace and stability. I think we can work together, and we have good basis to improve the relations, and now normalization is on the way. And the new government, I think, will see more action, more concrete also results with the new governments, and also Turkmens are part of it, which is a good thing. And especially with the trade, I think with the last assassination of some Turkish diplomats, couple of months ago, caused fears. The taking care of security, or generally there is a negative or kind of. Iraq is reminded always with the wars. When you say we are going to Erbil, people don't distinguish much. I think we need more also effort to explain that this is in a Turkish opinion, like the diaspora or other lobbies, but we need some lobbying, maybe business-wise or social and political issues, and people need to know that KRG is stable and is developing.
Some sort of economic interdependence.
I mean, we are doing as a think tank, we are explaining what's going on in the,
we're doing
in the region.
our
But
best, right?
yeah, I think we need more of this too. Sometimes the PKK discourse also spoil the mood in the KRG against Turkey. It's maybe like some negative things. Our media should go about. I mean, to get the real news. Sometimes these ultra-nationalistic tendencies hurt both sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
So I'll make a couple of comments on overcoming divisions in the diaspora. What's interesting to me is that, well, first of all, I think when you look at the Kurdish diaspora in Europe, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and so on, very different reality there from what you find in the United States. I want to make sure that we all agree to one idea. Diasporas are never static. Diaspora communities change over time. And in the United States, what we see is a unique opportunity because the Kurdish community is so diverse, has so many different phases of periods when people arrived, that they're perhaps more willing to engage in conversations about shared interests than they are in Europe, where they had a very different organizational structure and approach. Europe was significantly more militant and has also shifted over time. What we see in the United States are that there are some smaller militant groups, but they've found not sufficient success to reach out to general populations and the Kurdish communities. They're not dominating. So that means right now what you have are divisions within different generations of Kurds from the Kurdistan region that are not communicating very well because they have memories of what happened to them. And that needs to be resolved and addressed. And then we have what we always have in the United States when different people migrate and integrate in society and then become citizens, is that they become Americans. So they pursue new ideas that maybe aren't so familiar to their parents and grandparents in terms of advocating for a cause. So American society likes lawsuits. So what are some of the Kurdish business people do? But they pursue lawsuits against, for example, in relation to when Erdogan was in Washington, D.C. and had physical, his bodyguards had physical encounters. So what they do is they pursue a lawsuit against the Republic of Turkey. They become Americans. It's a different way of pursuing ideas. So think about young people emerging as and sharing new ideas and new approaches in terms of how to communicate beyond and beyond those divisions and creating a more wholesome discussion on what can be achieved in the future.
Okay. Thank you. Well, in terms of the question about federalism, of course, I agree federalism is always going to be a work in progress. But I think one of the important aspects of federalism is that there has to be buy-in from communities beyond the Kurdish community. I think one of the reasons that federalism hasn't been so successful in Iraq is that for many Iraqis, federalism has been seen as a kind of an underground way of trying to get Kurdish independence rather than a way to resolve Iraq's sort of over-centralized system. And that point of view has only been reinforced by the referendum, which obviously means now that federalism is seen as being a step on the way to independence rather than being a way to resolve the sort of Kurdish question and over-centralization more generally. So I think an important aspect to the success of federalism is whether communities beyond the Kurdish community buy into that notion of federalism. And that's really that's a difficult bridge to cross for Kurdish politicians by themselves. And the question on the diaspora, well, if we look at Kurdish nationalism, we talk about Kurds as a nation in the singular, but the lessons from Arab nationalism is that Arabs, of course, say that they're all part of one nation, but Egyptians and Iraqis and Saudis have very different political histories, very different cultural traditions, and have developed within the context of very different political circumstances. So, of course, there are overarching sort of cultural connections, but it's also important to recognize the significant divisions between the Kurdish community. So, 100 years ago, there was no such thing as an Iraqi Kurd or a Turkish Kurd because those political conditions didn't exist. But today, one can speak of an Iraqi Kurd or a southern Kurd, if you prefer, because the conditions that Kurds have grown up in Iraq are different from those in Turkey, which are different from those in Iran, which are different from those in Syria. So in terms of trying to bridge the gap of the divide between the different diaspora communities, I think that's quite difficult to do because those different communities have different historical experiences. So in terms of, if we're talking about KRG's attempts to lobby or mobilize, those efforts should be primarily directed towards Kurds of Iraq because the same questions aren't going to resonate amongst Kurds from Turkey or Kurds from Iran in the same way. I mean, of course, Halabja is a very important issue for all Kurds, but the way that Halabja is understood by Kurds in Turkey or Kurds in Iran is different from the way it's understood by Kurds in Iraq. So that's probably one of the point I would make about that. And then one final point, in terms of lobbying effort, I think ultimately when it comes to Turkey's relationship with the KRG, I think unfortunately, it's going to be a hostage to the Kurdish question within Turkey. So however the Kurdish question within Turkey is going, if the Turkish government feels that it's making progress in that field, it's going to be able to pursue a more open policy towards the KRG. However, if the Kurdish problem in Turkey is continuing, then even if Turkey has excellent economic and political relations with the KRG, the principle of sort of Kurdish self-rule in Iraq is some kind of problem. If we look at the referendum, in pure economic terms, Turkey would have benefited from Kurdish independence. Kurdistan would have basically become an economic colony of Turkey, and Turkey in the past has supported secessionist movements or contemplated the partition of Cyprus. So, Iraqi Kurdistan could have become independent and would have been completely dependent on Turkey. But because of the Kurdish issue in Turkey, that is a politically dangerous thing for any Turkish government to contemplate. And even if Turkish governments sort of intellectually know that they can sort of deal with the Kurdish question, there is still extreme nationalism in Turkey, and Turkish political leaders are still very reticent about, opening up to the Kurdish question. And that's not just to do with the current Turkish government, but also with the opposition parties as well. So this is this identity politics, as Dr. Kurdnejad mentioned, in Turkey plays a very important role in its attitude towards the Kurdish question in Iraq. So, Kurds in Iraq can do the best that they can, but ultimately there are conditions beyond their control for that they have to take care of.
Okay, and with these remarks, we're going to wrap up this panel on the first day of the conference. Thanks for a lot of thought-provoking ideas. Having said that, we've been so punctual with the time today, and I have to thank you again for your input, the distinguished panelists. Thank you for the audience for coming, and I hope to see you, everybody, tomorrow at 9:30 sharp again. Thank you very much.